Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey there, and welcome to another deep dive.
Hmm.
Today, we're going to Latin America.
Okay.
Back in the 1960s and the 70s.
Right.
It was a really intense time.
Yeah.
Young people were leading these huge movements for change.
It's a fascinating period.
It really is. We've got all sorts of amazing sources, declassified documents,
Yeah.
first-hand accounts, historical analysis. The whole course works to figure out what happened
Oh, cool.
in Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil.
Big changes happening in all three.
Huge, but in such different ways. It's like each country had its own unique flavor of revolution.
They did. The young people in these countries, they were all fighting against these authoritarian regimes.
Right.
But their paths were so different.
Okay, so let's break this down. What was it about this era that made it such fertile ground for these youth movements? I mean, was there like a single event that sparked it all off?
Well, you really can't talk about Latin American revolutions in this era without talking about Cuba,
Okay.
like Fidel Castro,
Yeah.
Che Guevara, and their revolution in 1959. It was this huge shockwave.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Imagine you're a young person in Latin America at this time, and you see this tiny island nation
Yeah.
overthrowing a dictator
Ooh.
with the support of the people. It was a powerful image,
I,
and it resonated
yeah.
deeply.
Totally. Like it showed them that change was actually possible.
Exactly. And Che Guevara,
Oh, yeah.
with his charisma and his revolutionary ideology, he became a global icon, especially for young people.
Makes sense.
And his message to the Tricontinental in 1967, that was a call to action.
I've heard of that.
He was basically urging people all over the world to rise up, to
Alright.
fight against what he saw as the evils of U.S. imperialism.
I remember learning about U.S. imperialism in school.
Yeah.
But it always felt kind of abstract. Like, what did that actually look like in Latin America in those days?
Well, think about it this way. For decades, the U.S. had been really involved
Mm.
in Latin American politics and economics.
Mm.
They often propped up these dictators.
Really?
Yeah. Ones who aligned with U.S. interests, even if those dictators were suppressing their own people. So that created a lot of resentment.
Yeah.
It fueled this feeling that these countries weren't truly independent.
Wow.
So when she called for this anti-imperialist struggle, it resonated
Yeah, makes sense.
with people who wanted to break free of U.S. influence, forge their own destinies.
So, okay. Young people see this successful revolution in Cuba. They hear Che's message, and suddenly it feels like change is possible. Did that lead to similar uprisings across the region?
It did, yeah, but the outcomes were really different. Like take Uruguay, for example, the Tupamaros. They emerged in the 1960s
Okay.
during this time of economic decline
Oh.
and rising inequality.
Ah.
In the beginning, they were almost like Robin Hood figures,
Really?
stealing from banks and corporations
Oh, wow.
and redistributing the wealth to the poor. They got a lot of support from the people.
I can see why.
They were challenging the establishment,
Yeah.
the corrupt establishment.
It's kind of a classic story. The people are suffering, and then this group emerges. They're willing to fight back, even if it means breaking the law.
It is, yeah.
But things escalated, right?
They did, yeah. The government started cracking down,
Yeah.
and the Tupamaros got bolder, more violent.
Oh,
They started kidnapping,
no way.
even executing people they saw as symbols of oppression.
This is where things get really interesting and complicated, right? Because you have to ask, when is violence justified in the name of revolution?
That's the big question. There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
A really important moment in the Tupamaros story was their kidnapping and execution of Dan Mitrione.
Okay.
He was a U.S. official working in Uruguay.
Hmm.
Now, on the surface, he seemed like this public safety advisor,
Uh-huh.
but declassified documents later revealed a much darker truth.
Ooh, this is like something out of a spy thriller. What did they uncover?
Well, it turns out that Mitrione was training the Uruguayan police
In what?
in interrogation and torture techniques.
Oh, whoa.
The Tupamaros saw him as a symbol of U.S. imperialism and these brutal tactics that were being used to silence dissent all across Latin America. They argued his execution was necessary,
Wow.
a necessary act of resistance against a system that was just perpetuating violence and oppression.
That's a really powerful example and really disturbing how things aren't always what they seem. You have this guy seemingly working for the public good, But then behind the scenes, he's involved in these horrific practices. It makes you wonder how many other Mitriones were out there operating in the shadows.
Right. It really complicates the whole narrative, and it raises these tough questions about the ethics of revolutionary violence, even when it's aimed at someone who's directly responsible for human rights abuses.
Right, because on the one hand, Mitrione's actions were reprehensible.
They were.
But the Tupamaros' decision to execute him without a trial is also morally complex. It kind of shows us the slippery slope that revolutionary movements can find themselves on, where the lines between justice and vengeance can get blurred.
Absolutely. And the impact of the Mitrione incident, it went way beyond just the individual case.
Oh, I bet.
It became a major international incident.
Yeah.
The U.S. condemned it, and it gave the Uruguayan government even more reason to crack down on the Tupamaros.
So it's like this act of violence aimed at exposing state-sponsored brutality actually ended up fueling the very repression they were fighting against.
That's the irony of it. And this brings us to the 1973 military coup in Uruguay,
Right.
which started this brutal 12-year dictatorship.
Oh, wow.
A lot of people argue that the Tupamaros, even though they were fighting for noble ideals,
Yeah.
they unintentionally created the conditions for this crackdown.
Really?
By using these increasingly violent tactics, they alienated potential supporters,
Yeah.
and they gave the government a reason to escalate the repression.
So the question becomes, was there another way? Could they have achieved their goals without resorting to those tactics?
It's a question historians are still trying to figure out. But let's shift gears a bit. Let's move south to Argentina. Another group was trying to shake things up there. The Montoneros. They emerged in the 1960s, but they really gained momentum in the 1970s.
Okay.
It was a time of intense political and economic turmoil in Argentina.
And they were inspired by a very different figurehead, weren't they?
They were. The Montoneros drew inspiration from Eva Perón, Evita.
Evita. I remember seeing that musical.
Right.
She was a fascinating and complex figure.
She was, especially among the working class.
Right.
She became this icon for her advocacy for social justice and her charismatic personality.
So the Montoneros wanted to kind of revive her legacy.
Exactly. They wanted to create a more just and equitable society, one that prioritized the needs of the poor and the marginalized.
Okay.
But, like the Tupamaros, their methods were controversial.
How?
They engaged in armed robberies,
Whoa.
kidnappings,
Really?
even extortions. They targeted the wealthy and powerful.
It sounds like they were trying to operate as this parallel power structure,
They were.
challenging the legitimacy of the state itself. And I can see how those tactics would be very polarizing. But I'm guessing things got even more intense in Argentina.
Oh, absolutely. In 1976, a military junta led by Jorge Rafael Videla seized power.
Okay.
It was one of the darkest chapters in Argentina's history.
What happened?
It's called the Dirty War.
I've heard that phrase, but I never really understood the full extent of it.
Well, it was a systematic campaign of terror
Oh, wow.
organized by the state
Really?
to silence any opposition to the military regime.
Oh, my God.
Tens of thousands of people, students, activists, intellectuals, anyone suspected of being leftist,
Wow.
they were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered.
That's horrible.
Many were they just disappeared.
Wow.
No one knows what happened to them.
It's hard to even imagine that level of brutality, especially when you consider that many of the victims were young people who were simply trying to make a difference.
It was. And this is where the social history lens becomes so important.
Okay.
It helps us understand the impact, not just on this big scale of politics and revolution,
Yeah.
but on the lives of everyday people.
Right.
The trauma of the dirty war, the loss of loved ones, the fear, it permeated the whole society.
Yeah.
It had a profound and lasting impact on Argentine society.
Right, because history isn't just about these abstract forces and events. It's about real people who lived and loved and suffered through these things. Their stories matter.
They do.
Yeah.
And this brings us to Brazil, where the military coup in 1964 also led to a long period of authoritarian rule.
Right.
But unlike Uruguay and Argentina, the resistance in Brazil was less centralized,
Okay.
less about armed struggle, and more about these widespread student protests.
So less about taking up arms and more about raising their voices.
Yes, and these protests were huge.
Right.
One of the most famous moments was the March of the 100,000 in São Paulo in 1968.
Wow.
It brought together students, workers, intellectuals, all demanding democratic reforms and economic justice.
Wow, that's a powerful image. So many people coming together, despite the risks, demanding change.
It was a real act of defiance,
Right.
a testament to the power of collective action.
Mm-hmm.
But the government responded with force, with repression. They framed any kind of dissent as a threat to national security. It's a tactic that's often used by authoritarian regimes to justify their actions.
It's chilling, isn't it? How they try to control the narrative, painting anyone who opposes them as a dangerous enemy.
It is, and it worked for a while.
Mm-hmm.
The military dictatorship in Brazil lasted until 1985.
Wow.
Silencing a lot of voices along the way.
So we have 3 countries, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil, all facing similar challenges, but their youth movements took such different paths. The Tupamaros embracing armed struggle, the Montoneros trying to revive Evita's legacy,
Right.
and the Brazilian students taking to the streets in protest. What happened next? Did any of these movements achieve lasting change?
That's what we'll find out
Okay.
when we come back for part 2
Right.
of this deep dive into youth, revolution, and repression in Latin America.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil,
Right.
and how each one had its own youth resistance movement in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah,
They all faced this common enemy, though.
they did.
Authoritarian regimes that would do anything to hold on to power.
Anything. And they used repression as a tool to silence their opponents.
Okay, let's zoom in on that. We've talked about these specific groups and these big events, but what did that actually look like for everyday people?
Well, imagine living in a society where you can't even trust your neighbors,
Oh, wow.
where speaking out against the government could get you arrested,
Really?
tortured,
Oh, God.
even disappeared.
Oh.
That was the reality for millions of people.
It's like living in a constant state of fear.
Exactly. Think about Argentina's dirty war.
Yeah.
An estimated 30,000 people just vanished.
Wow.
Their families never knew what happened to them.
Oh, that's awful.
It created this chilling effect on anyone who even thought about questioning the regime. It was designed to break people, to break their spirit of resistance.
Yeah.
And it left scars on Argentine society, scars that are still felt today.
It's not just physical violence then, it's psychological too, like crushing dissent by creating this climate of fear where people are too scared to even speak up.
Exactly. And it went hand in hand with propaganda. They had to control the narrative.
Oh yeah, make the regime look good.
Strong, justified.
Right?
Like, remember that quote from that Brazilian textbook?
Uh-huh.
The armed forces combat this menace and remind us of our obligation for hierarchy and discipline. They were saying that any kind of disagreement was a threat to national security. It's a tactic used all the time.
It's a classic way for dictators to hold on to power. Twist the truth to make it work for them. But what about these youth movements? How did they handle this repression? Did they back down?
It varied. Some people, they were just scared.
I bet.
Disillusioned, they went into exile, or they just gave up on activism altogether. But others were pushed to fight back even harder,
Okay.
like the Tupamaros in Uruguay.
Right.
They felt like violence was the only way, that their oppressors would listen.
Like fight fire with fire. But did it work?
That's where the debate gets really interesting. Some historians believe that when the Tupamaros got more radical,
Yeah.
it actually backfired.
I so.
They lost support. And it gave the government the perfect excuse to come down even harder, like the 1973 coup in Uruguay,
Right.
which brought in this really harsh dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
Some people see that as a direct result of this whole cycle of violence.
So their attempt to fight back actually made things worse. They strengthened the very system they were trying to overthrow.
That's one interpretation. But others say that the Tupamaros at least brought attention to the brutality of the regime, even if real change didn't happen right away.
It's a tough one. Their courage is admirable, but you have to wonder about the effectiveness of their methods and the consequences.
Absolutely. And we see this complexity play out in Argentina, too. The Montoneros.
Right.
They were inspired by Evita and her fight for social justice,
Mm-hmm.
but they also got caught up in this violence and repression.
They wanted to help the people, but the things they did, like the kidnappings and robberies, probably turned a lot of people away.
They did.
Yeah.
And the military junta, they used it to their advantage. They called them terrorists and used their actions to justify their own violence.
It's a scary reminder that controlling people's perceptions is a really powerful tool for authoritarian regimes. But what about Brazil?
Yeah,
Their student movement was more about protests, right?
it was.
Not so much armed conflict. But I'm guessing they still faced a lot of pushback.
Oh, they did. They didn't have a central group like the Tupamaros or the Montoneros, but they were still really diverse and resilient. They organized these huge demonstrations.
Right.
They made underground newspapers. They even used art and music as protest.
It sounds like they were really tapping into a cultural shift, finding creative ways to express their discontent and challenge the regime's control over information.
Exactly. And they won sometimes. They forced the government to back down on some things. But there were also brutal crackdowns.
Right.
Remember that high school student who was killed?
The one in Rio de Janeiro?
Yes. He was protesting for cheaper meals.
It's heartbreaking that a young person would be killed for demanding something so basic.
It is. And it sparked outrage, led to even bigger protests.
Wow.
The military responded with more force, more arrests, and more censorship. But the resistance kept going.
So these youth movements, even though they faced huge challenges and setbacks, they didn't just fade away, they had a real impact.
They did. A lot of people believe their struggle, even when it didn't succeed right away, laid the groundwork for the wave of democratization that swept through Latin America in the 80s and 90s.
So their sacrifices, even when they faced defeat, contributed to positive change.
That's one way to look at it. Their actions, they chipped away at the power of these authoritarian regimes, exposed their cruelty to the world, and they inspired others to keep fighting for justice and democracy. Plus, they created this incredible cultural legacy that still resonates today.
I'm really intrigued by that cultural impact. We touched on Che and Evita, but how did these movements actually shape art and music and literature in Latin America?
It's a fascinating story. It's like these movements seeped into every corner of culture. Think about the protest songs of Mercedes Sosa in Argentina.
Okay.
Or the lyrics of Chico Buarque in Brazil.
Yeah.
They used music to give voice to the voiceless.
It's like art became a weapon against these regimes, a way to express dissent and keep hope alive, even when things felt really dark.
Exactly. And it wasn't just music. It was literature, theater, visual arts. They all played a crucial role in the resistance. These artists and writers, they risked their lives to create work that challenged the way things were and imagined something better.
So we're talking about an entire generation of artists who were deeply involved in the struggles of their time. They used their art to push for change.
Exactly. And that legacy still inspires artists and activists today. Their struggles, their sacrifices, their unwavering fight for justice, it's all woven into the fabric of Latin American culture.
It shows that art and activism can work together, that creativity can be a powerful force.
Yeah.
But let's bring this back to our listeners for a second.
Okay.
Why should they care about all of this? These events happened decades ago in a completely different part of the world.
That's a great question. And it's a question that gets to the heart of why we even bother studying history. These movements in Latin America, they teach us so much about the way power works, the importance of dissent, and the never-ending human struggle for freedom and justice. They show that even when things feel impossible, ordinary people can make a difference.
It's like that Margaret Mead quote. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And these movements remind us that the fight for justice, it's rarely simple. There are going to be setbacks, tragedies, unforeseen consequences. But even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can win.
It's a story of hope, then, of resilience, and the power of collective action. But we're not done yet.
Not quite.
We've talked about the background, the rise and fall of these movements, their impact on culture. But what about their legacy in today's world? Are they still relevant to contemporary social movements?
We'll find out when we come back.
Okay.
For the final part of this deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Latin American youth movements. We've been talking about how young people in Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil stood up to these authoritarian regimes back in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
They faced incredible repression, but they also made real change.
It's a really powerful part of history. It's inspiring, but also, kind of tragic. These movements didn't always succeed in what they set out to do. And a lot of people suffered for their beliefs.
Right.
But their courage and commitment to justice, it left a mark, not just in those countries, but around the world.
Okay, so let's talk about that global impact. How did these events in Latin America influence movements in other parts of the world?
Well, for one, they showed that even the most powerful regimes can be challenged by the people. They inspired activists in other countries to stand up to their governments, to demand change. And they helped raise awareness of human rights abuses and the need for international solidarity.
Right, like sending a message to the world that we will not be silenced, We will fight for our rights no matter what.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that message, it went way beyond Latin America. Think about the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa.
Okay.
The fight for democracy in Eastern Europe, even the civil rights movement here in the U.S. All of those movements were influenced by what happened in Latin America.
So it's like this chain reaction of inspiration, one movement learning from the struggles of those that came before.
That's a great way to put it. And it also brings us to another really important part of their legacy, using culture as a tool for resistance.
Right. We've talked about Mercedes Sosa and Chico Buarque,
Right.
but it was so much bigger than just a few artists. It was this whole wave of expression, challenging the official story, giving a voice to people who had been silenced.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about the protest songs,
Yeah.
the murals, the poems, the plays.
Yeah.
It's like they created this whole new language of resistance, using art to speak truth to power.
And that language, it spoke to people on this deep emotional level. It helped build connections. It gave people hope and kept the spirit of resistance alive, even during those really dark times.
So it wasn't just about changing laws or governments. It was about changing how people felt, about creating a culture of resistance that could keep the movement going.
Exactly. And that's a lesson that's still important today.
Okay, so let's bring this home. We've talked about the context, the effects, the legacy, but what does it mean for us now? Why should we care about these events that happened so long ago on another continent?
Because the things they were fighting for, social justice, equality, freedom, basic human rights, those issues haven't gone away. In a lot of ways, they're even more urgent now.
We're dealing with climate change, rising inequality, political divisions, threats to democracy. It can feel like a lot.
It really can. But that's why it's so important to remember the past. It can give us hope.
Right.
Guidance. These movements in Latin America, they show us that even when things feel hopeless, ordinary people can make change happen. They remind us that it is possible. But it takes courage, commitment, and a willingness to challenge the way things are.
So it's not about giving up. It's about learning from those who came before, who fought for a better world, and left us this legacy of hope and resistance.
Exactly. And that legacy, we don't just inherit it. We have to be a part of it. We have to keep it going. We have to ask ourselves, what are we doing to fight injustice? How are we speaking out against oppression? What kind of world are we building for the future?
Those are tough questions, but they're questions we all need to think about. And maybe by looking back at the past, at the struggles and the victories of those who came before us, we can find the strength and the wisdom to create a better future for everyone.
Well said.
That wraps up our deep dive into youth, revolution, and repression in Latin America. We covered a lot, but there's so much more to explore.
There is. I definitely encourage you to check out the sources we mentioned.
Yeah, dive in.
There's so much to learn, so many stories to uncover.
And remember, history isn't just something in a textbook. It shapes us. It shapes our world. By learning from the past, understanding those who came before us, we can build a better future for ourselves and for everyone who comes after. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.